The first thing you need to understand about the Kharveth is that they are not pets. I know how that sounds coming from me. I know what the clips look like. Des with his chin on my knee, Ova with her entire spine draped over my feet like she's a rug that grew legs and learned to snore. I know the Kethavar circuit posted that image from the sub-level corridor, the one where I'm sitting cross-legged on the stone with my lunch pail and both cubs are pressed against me, and the caption said, "Our gentle giants," and got 12,000 shares from people who hadn't the faintest idea what they were looking at. I didn't complain. The circuit wanted a good image that cycle, and I was convenient. But I want to be clear, before I tell you what happened on the day of the grand renewal, before I tell you what Hollow Spine did, and what Davath As's face looked like when she did it. The Kharveth are not pets. They are not tamed. They are not domesticated in any meaningful sense of the word. They are six-limbed apex predators from a world where nothing eats them, and the soil runs red for 2 months after the spring thaw. They weigh between 900 kilograms and 1,400 kilograms as adults. Their spine crests, the amber ridges that run from the back of the skull down to the base of the tail, can stand 40 centimeters proud of the body when the animal is fully alarmed. And when that happens, the sound they produce is not a growl. It is more like the world deciding to come apart at the seams, low enough to press against your sternum and make your teeth ache. In 40 years of operation, the Kethavar Grand Circuit had recorded 61 fatalities directly attributable to Kharveth contact. 61. Some of those were accidents, some were not. I am telling you this so that when I describe what happened on the arena floor that afternoon, you understand the scale of it. Not because I am trying to impress you. I'm a pen tender. I clean enclosures and weigh feed rations and keep health logs. Impressing people is not in my contract. My name is Yara Salk. I am 38 years old. I have worked the sub-level beast maintenance corridor at Kethavar Grand Circuit for 3 years, 4 months, and roughly 11 days. Before that, I worked a similar position at Darvel Station's Wildlife Management Division for 6 years, which is where I first learned to sit still in the dirt next to something large enough to eat me without breaking a sweat. That is the whole of my relevant qualification. I sat still. I'll explain. The Kharveth came to Kethavar 2 cycles before I did. There were 8 of them when they arrived, 4 adults, 3 subadults, and 1 cub that was so young and so absolutely furious about its situation that the receiving team spent the better part of a day getting her into a temporary pen without anyone losing a hand. That cub was Hollow Spine, though she wasn't called that yet. She was called Subject 4C in the circuit's records, and nobody had gotten close enough to name her anything personal. The 3 adults who arrived with her were dead within 18 months. Not from mishandling, to the circuit's credit. The transition from their origin world's atmosphere and biome to the Kethavar facility is genuinely hard on mature animals, and the Kharveth are territorial enough that the stress of the relocation compounded everything. The subadults survived and are still in the deep pens at the far end of the corridor. They've never fully acclimated. They're functional and fed, and their health metrics are acceptable, and they will never let a human being within 4 meters of them without expressing clear distress, and that is fine. That is the correct response to captivity for an animal with their cognitive profile. It means they are sane. Hollow Spine was different. She was young enough when she arrived that Kethavar was, in some sense, the only world she knew well. She was also, this is the word the behaviorists use, though they argue about it, curious. The adults and subadults in the deep pens read human presence as a threat to be managed. Hollow Spine read it as something worth examining. That is a crucial difference. It is not warmth. It is not affection, not at first. It is more like the way a very intelligent creature inventories everything in its territory and decides which elements belong in which category. Threat, resource, irrelevance, and occasionally, apparently, something else. By the time I arrived at Kethavar, Hollow Spine was 4 years old, approximately 110 kilograms past full adult weight, and had already cycled through 6 contracted handlers. Not because she'd hurt any of them, though two had resigned citing stress factors they declined to elaborate on. Mostly because handling the Kharveth at Kharveth required a very specific kind of temperament, and the circuit's HR division kept hearing for physical qualifications instead of psychological ones. You'd want someone large and physically capable, which made a certain logical sense, except that size means absolutely nothing to a Kharveth. They have eaten things considerably larger than any person the circuit could have recruited. What Hollow Spine responded to, what she had been responding to, I learned later from the behavioral logs, for the better part of 2 years before I arrived, was stillness. Not submission, not dominance, not the careful choreography of a trained animal handler moving in specific patterns to signal non-threat. Plain physical stillness. The absence of the particular quality of movement that signals fear. I didn't know that when I started. I learned it the way I'd learned it at Darvel, by sitting in the corridor outside the pen threshold, eating my lunch, and waiting to see what the animal did with me. The first day, Hollow Spine stayed at the back of her enclosure. She watched me. I ate my rice and read my health log review notes and didn't look directly at her. The space between us was approximately 6 meters, which is roughly the distance at which her spine crests began to register on the environmental sensors as elevated. They were elevated. I could see that without looking at her. I ate my rice and did not move. The second day she came 3 meters closer to the threshold and watched me from there. I had a different lunch. I ate that instead. By the end of the second week, she was at the threshold when I arrived, and she would stand there watching me while I worked the outer pen maintenance, the drainage channels, the feed chutes, the environmental filter checks. She never crossed the threshold. She watched me with her secondary eyes, the ones on the lateral ridge of the skull that swivel independently of the primary pair, and her spine crest stayed at 60% elevation. And eventually she would lose interest and go back to whatever a Kharveth does in a large enclosed space. Thinks, probably. They are clearly thinking most of the time. It is one of the things that makes them unsettling in a way that has nothing to do with the teeth. The first time she crossed the threshold was on a shift change evening in my 3rd month. I'd stayed late to rerun a metabolic sample that hadn't processed correctly, and the corridor was quiet. And when I looked up from my work panel, she was 6 feet away, standing in the open passage, watching my hands. I had a stylus in my right hand. I set it down on the panel surface. I sat back from the panel. I put my hands on my knees and I looked at the panel without looking at her, and I waited. She stood there for 4 minutes and 23 seconds. I know the exact time because the corridor camera log was pulled in the inquiry afterward. Then she went back into her enclosure. I picked up my stylus and finished my work. That was the whole of it. But it meant something to her, evidently, because after that evening the threshold was never really a barrier between us in the same way. She began appearing at the pen door at the beginning of my shifts, and over the course of the next several weeks, the distance between us shortened by increments that were slow enough that I barely registered them as movement. By month 5, she would occasionally settle at the far end of the outer corridor while I worked the near end, and the spine crests would be at maybe 30% elevation, which the behavioral logs noted as the lowest recorded reading for any Kharveth at Kharveth, except in deep sleep. The behaviorist on staff at that time, a young woman called Dr. Kharveth, who had the slightly haunted look of someone who had not expected their posting to be quite so interesting, started showing up to observe my shifts. She was very good about being quiet. I didn't mind her. She brought her own lunch. She was the one who coined the phrase. She'd been watching for 3 months, filling 7 data pads with observations. And she had a theory about what Hollow Spine was reading in my presence that the animal found acceptable. She called it soil still. It was a translation of a term in one of the older Kharveth contact studies, an attempt by a xenobehaviorist named Kharveth to describe the specific quality of non-movement that the Kharveth associated with a creature that belonged to the same ecological category as themselves. Not threat, not prey, not handler, something lateral. Something that sat in the dirt like it had a right to be there. Ress said it slightly apologetically, the way young researchers do when they know their terminology is going to be dismissed by whoever controls the budget. She said, "The closest analog I can identify in the literature is a concept the Kharveth behavioral file calls soil still. It describes a predator at rest that is not at rest because it is comfortable but because it is confident. The animal reads your stillness as that kind of rest. It reads you as something that does not need to move because it is not afraid of what is in the territory with it." I said that sounded plausible to me. She said, "It means she has categorized you as, and I want to be clear I'm using an approximation here, as something like a peer." I ate my lunch. Res Ovath went on to publish a paper on soil still recognition behaviors in confined Kharveth specimens that apparently generated considerable discussion in the xenobehavioral literature, though I didn't read it at the time. I was busy with the drainage channels. The cubs arrived 14 months into my contract. Hollow Spine's first litter since captivity, 2 cubs, born in the back corner of the deep pen in the early hours of a third-shift morning, discovered by the overnight monitor. 2 cubs, both alive, both furious. She named them herself, in the sense that she spent the first week making clear to anyone who entered the pen corridor that the cubs were not available for inspection, observation, or veterinary interference of any kind. And it was only after I sat outside the threshold for 2 days running that she eventually permitted me through. I named them Des and Ova. Des for the male, who had a slightly lopsided spine crest that gave him the look of someone perpetually asking a question. Ova for the female, who was smaller and completely certain of herself from the moment she opened her eyes. In my professional notes, I referred to them as C1 male and C1 female. In my own head, they were Des and Ova from day 4. What I learned in the 14 months between the cubs' arrival and the grand renewal demonstration is that young Kharveth learned their social categories from the dam, not from experience, not primarily from her behavior, from watching how she reads the world around them and maps it into the taxonomy of their existence. Who is threat? Who is resource? Who is irrelevant? And who, apparently, is something the cubs picked up from her as efficiently as they picked up everything else. By the time Des was 8 months old, he had worked out how to sit on my feet. He did this with the absolute confidence of an animal that had never been told it was too large to sit on people's feet. By that point, he was approximately the size of a mature earth bear and showed no sign of planning to stop growing. I moved my feet less than I might have because moving them seemed to disappoint him, and disappointed Kharveth cubs make a sound very much like a low, continuous complaint that carries through the stone walls of the sublevel corridor and makes the other handlers think something has gone wrong. Ova preferred my hands. She would put her head on them. She would put the full weight of her skull, which by 8 months was roughly equivalent to a modest piece of furniture, onto my hands, and she would close her eyes, and Hollow Spine would be sitting behind her at what I had come to think of as her supervisory position, watching to make sure everything was in order. This is what I mean when I say the Kharveth are not pets, because none of that, not a single moment of it, was because they needed me or because they had been conditioned to seek my presence or because they were in any way domesticated. They were apex predators who had, through a process I still don't entirely understand, decided that I belonged in their territory in the same category as themselves. They were not affectionate. They were collegial. There is a difference. I understood this. Res Ovath understood this. 2 or 3 of the other pen tenders on the corridor understood this. Daveth Os did not understand this, or if he did, he didn't consider it relevant. Daveth Os was a counselor. Specifically, he was a circuit counselor in the second rank of Kethavar's administration, which meant he was 3 steps below actual governance authority and 2 steps above anyone who did actual work. He was responsible for the Grand Circuit's asset portfolio. which included the Kharveth, and his primary engagement with the Kharveth program was to review their health metrics twice a season and to appear in the circuit's promotional materials standing at a safe distance from Hollow Spine, with the expression of a man who has rehearsed looking unafraid. He had never been in the pen corridor when I was there. He'd done a walkthrough once before my contract, and the behavioral logs had noted that Hollow Spine's spine crests had gone to full elevation and stayed there for the duration of his visit and for approximately 40 minutes after he left. He didn't come back. What he had done, in the months leading up to the grand renewal, was build the Kharveth demonstration into the centerpiece of the season's flagship event. The grand renewal was a tradition of the Kharveth circuit, a multi-day spectacle event, part ceremony, part athletic competition, part exhibition, attended by the council, by the Midrim Transit Authority's oversight delegates, and by approximately 40,000 general admission spectators across the final day. It was the circuit's most significant annual event, and Os had attached his career to making this one exceptional. The centerpiece he had designed was a demonstration of Kharveth command response on the arena floor. Not a fight. The circuit had moved away from direct combat exhibitions some years back, for reasons that involved both ethics and insurance. This was to be a demonstration of what the promotional materials called controlled behavioral sovereignty, which was Os's way of saying that the Kharveth would be brought onto the arena floor, would respond to command signals from the circuit's official handling team, and would demonstrate, in front of 40,000 witnesses and the oversight delegation, that they were not a liability but an asset. A controlled, managed, impressive asset that justified the circuit's continued operational license for large predator species. I learned the details of this plan from Res Ovath, who'd been briefed by the Behavioral Oversight Committee, and who came to my shift 2 weeks before the renewal looking like someone who had bad news and was working up to it. She sat on the floor outside Hollow Spine's pen threshold. Hollow Spine was at the threshold, watching her with the lateral eyes. The cubs were somewhere behind the dam, audible but not visible. Russ said, "The demonstration is going ahead." I said, "I know." She said, "The official handling team is going to lead them up." I said, "I know that too." She paused. "You've seen the official handling team's interaction logs with the pen, with this pen specifically." I had. The official handling team consisted of 4 individuals in full ceremonial handler gear, the armored, calibrated, rigged kit that the circuit used for public-facing animal display work. They were competent people. 2 of them had genuine xenobiology backgrounds. All 4 of them had done the approach protocols correctly on every visit. Hollow Spine's spine crests had been at full elevation for every one of those visits. There's a particular fact about the Kharveth spine crest response that the promotional materials don't mention. The crests elevate in response to perceived threat. They also elevate in response to something more nuanced, in response to something the xenobehavioral literature describes as categorical misclassification. When a Kharveth is in the presence of something that is behaving as though it belongs in a category it has not been assigned to, the crests go up. Not necessarily aggressively, but clearly. The official handling team, in their ceremonial kit, was behaving as though they had authority over animals that had not assigned them authority. The crests said so every time. Res said, "There's a possibility that on the day, with the crowd noise and the new environment, the stress factors compound." I said, "Yes." She said, "I've submitted 3 reports to OS recommending against the demonstration format, or at minimum recommending that the pen's primary contact handler be present on the arena floor, at least in an advisory capacity, at least for the initial release." I said, "What did he say?" She said, "He said the demonstration was designed for visual impact, and an off-rank maintenance tender on the floor would undermine the visual impact." I ate my lunch. Des had appeared at the threshold during this conversation, and was watching Ress with the slightly accusatory expression he adopted when new people entered his corridor and didn't bring anything interesting. I said, "He's calling me an off-rank maintenance tender." Ress said, "I'm quoting." I said, "That's accurate." She said, "I'm sorry." I said it was fine. It wasn't precisely fine, but it was nothing I hadn't heard before and nothing worth making a problem over. I was a pen tender. I cleaned drains and tracked metabolic samples and ate my lunch in the corridor, and the reason any of this worked was because I had never tried to be anything other than that. The moment I began to need it to be something, to need recognition or authority or the approval of a counselor, I would have stopped being able to do it. The Kharveth would have read it in a day. I went back to work. The morning of the grand renewal final day, I arrived at the sub-level corridor at my normal shift time. The corridor was different. There were people in it who were not normally there, two of the official handlers doing equipment checks, a circuit technical team running cable for the arena hoist system, a security officer standing at the corridor junction looking at nothing. Hollow-Spine's pen was quiet. I could hear the Cubs, the low ambient vocalization they made in the morning that was technically a contact call checking, very softly, that the territory was as expected. They did it every morning. It sounded like distant thunder that hadn't decided to commit. I did my morning checks. I filled the feed dispensers. I ran the environmental monitors. I sat down in my usual spot outside the pen threshold with my breakfast. Hollow Spine came to the threshold at her usual time. She stood looking at me. The spine-crests were at about 40%. The corridor had too many new people in it for her preference, but the new people were keeping their distance from her pen, and I was in the expected location doing the expected things, and this seemed to be, for the moment, tolerable. I ate my breakfast and read my logs. Des appeared behind her and pushed past her shoulder to look at me. He was, at this point, 14 months old and approximately the size of a very large horse, and he had not yet learned or chosen to learn that he did not fit through doorways his mother walked through easily. He got halfway through the threshold, registered the physical constraint, and sat down in the threshold with his legs sticking out either side, which is how he dealt with most situations that didn't resolve themselves immediately. Ova appeared behind him and looked over his back with an expression of complete composure. I gave Des a piece of dried protein block from my pocket. He ate it and remained sitting in the threshold. The security officer at the junction was watching this. At approximately 2 hours before the arena demonstration, the official handling team came to the pen corridor. All 4 of them in the ceremonial kit, accompanied by Counselor Oss and 2 aides. Oss had not been in this corridor since before my contract, and he looked, very briefly, like someone who had forgotten precisely how large the Kharveth were in person. He also looked at me with the expression of someone who has registered an inconvenient element and is deciding how to address it. He said, "I thought the morning handler rotation was completing by now." I said, "I'm still on shift, another hour." He said, "Right, the team is going to begin prep for the load-up." He said this the way you say something that is simultaneously an explanation and an instruction. I said, "Sure." Hollow Spine was at the back of the pen. She had retreated when Oss's group arrived in the corridor. Her spine crests were at full elevation. I could hear the subharmonics beginning, not the full threat register, not yet, but the pre-signal undertone that the environmental sensors flagged as condition orange. The senior official handler, a man named Thren with a professional manner and the slightly strained expression of someone who has read all the preparation reports, glanced at the environmental sensor panel. He saw the orange flag. He said quietly to me, "Has she been presenting at this level since this morning?" I said no. She came down to about 40% when I got here. She's reading the team. He nodded. He said, also quietly, if we gave it another 30 minutes before approach. Oss said, "The load-up timeline is fixed to the arena schedule." He said it pleasantly. He said it with the confidence of someone who has fixed timelines to arena schedules and regards the feelings of large animals as a secondary consideration. Thren said nothing more. As looked at me again. He said, "You can complete your shift from the outer corridor." The outer corridor is the section before the pen access junction, the section where the handling team had their equipment staged. It would mean leaving the pen side corridor, leaving the threshold, leaving the space that Hollow Spine and the Cubs had oriented to my presence in for 3 years. It would mean removing the one variable in this environment that was reading correctly to them. I said, the Cubs tend to be unsettled by routine changes on the day of. As said, the team is certified for Cub management. I understand you've had a good working relationship with this cohort, and we appreciate the work you've done. He said this in the tone of someone closing a paragraph. But the demonstration parameters are designed around the official handler engagement protocol. An additional presence is a confound. I said, okay. I picked up my pack and walked to the outer corridor. I don't know what I expected. I think I expected the handling team to manage it, slowly, carefully, with the skill they genuinely had, even if Hollow Spine's initial response to them was elevated. I expected that the load-up would take longer than the timeline As had fixed. I expected Thren to push back on the timeline. I expected one of the other 3 handlers to push back. I heard from the outer corridor the sound of Hollow Spine's spine-crests going to full alert. Not condition orange, condition red. The sound is different. It carries differently through the stone, more lateral, more resonant, the kind of sound that makes the concrete feel slightly unstable. I heard one of the team say something in a careful low voice. I heard the environmental alert tone shift registers. I heard Des, for the first time in 14 months, produce a sound I had only read about in the behavioral literature. The high-frequency contact distress call, the Cub sound that means something has gone wrong in the territory and the Cubs don't know where the center is. I sat in the outer corridor for 4 minutes. Then I picked up my pack and walked back to the pen side corridor. As saw me come back. He said, "I asked you to wait in the outer." I said, "I know." I walked to my spot at the pen threshold. I set my pack down. I sat down in the dirt. It wasn't dirt exactly. It was the composite stone surface of the corridor floor. But over 3 years of sitting there, it had acquired the texture of something more than hard floor, the kind of surface that a body knows. I sat down and I put my hands on my knees. Hollow Spine was at the back of the pen. Her spine crests were fully raised, every one of the amber ridges standing at maximum extension, and the sound she was producing was the pre-territorial warning, 4 steps below active aggression, but nothing you'd want to be standing in front of. The 4 handlers were arrayed at the gate. None of them were making bad decisions. All of them were very still. Thren was watching the sensor panel. I did not say anything to Hollow Spine. This is a mistake people make. They talk to them. They try to soothe with voice, and what the Kharveth reads in that is effort, which is what fear produces. I sat in the corridor and I was still and I looked at the composite stone floor. I heard, after perhaps 90 seconds, the sound of Hollow Spine's subharmonic shift registers. Not down to normal, but down, from condition red to condition orange, then slowly from condition orange toward something the sensors were probably reading as elevated yellow. I heard Ova's contact call, the normal morning one, the soft rolling check sound. I heard Des move from somewhere in the back of the pen toward the threshold, the heavy rhythmic percussion of 6 large feet on stone. He appeared at the threshold. He looked at me. He sat down in the threshold the way he always sat down in the threshold, with his legs sticking out on either side, and the spine crests on his back were at perhaps 35%. As said from somewhere behind me, "This is exactly." Thren said quietly but clearly, "Sir, she's coming down." Hollow Spine walked from the back of the pen to the threshold. She did not come through the threshold. She stood at it and looked at me, and the spine crests were at approximately 30%, and she made a sound that the behavioral literature described as a low-amplitude contact assertion, which is the sound the Kharveth used to mark the boundaries of agreed territory. The sound that says, "This is where the territory is. This is what is in it." As said, "Load up is delayed 18 minutes. We're behind the arena schedule." He said this to Thren. He said it like something had gone wrong that was not his doing. I stayed where I was. Thren was doing what a good handler does, which is nothing visible and a great deal internally. He had positioned himself and the 3 other team members in the middle corridor, not advancing on the pen, not retreating, not doing anything that carried urgency. One of the team, a younger woman whose name I learned later was Dren, had her sensor gauntlet reading the environmental data and was very carefully not looking directly at the pen. The numbers on her gauntlet would have been showing condition orange holding, which was not the worst outcome available, but was not the outcome anyone had planned for. The problem with condition orange is that it is stable only as long as nothing changes. A noise from the arena above, a shift in the ventilation, a change in smell or light or the quality of what the lateral eyes are reading from the human bodies in the corridor. Hollow Spine had mapped every variable in her environment with the thoroughness of an animal whose survival depends on knowing the territory exactly, and what she was doing right now, behind those crests, was not resting. She was computing. She was running the new elements, the smell of the ceremonial kit, the posture of 4 people she had not assigned a category, the continued absence of the one element she had categorized and found acceptable. And she was working out whether the territory had changed in a way that required a response. The cubs were behind her. That was the most important fact in the corridor. When the dam is computing, the cubs stay behind her, and when they stay behind her, the subharmonics rise whether she chooses to produce them or not. It is involuntary. It is the body preparing for what the mind hasn't decided yet. I knew this, Thren knew this, Dren's gauntlet knew this, Os knew the arena schedule. I stayed where I was. The load-up in the end happened differently than Os had planned. Thren made a decision, with the quiet authority of a professional who had been watching sensor readings for 20 minutes, and had decided that the timeline was less important than getting 4 Kharveth into a lift cage without an incident. He asked me, not Os, whether I thought Hollow Spine would follow through the corridor if I led. I said I didn't know. I said she'd never been asked to go anywhere specific by me. I said she followed me around the corridor when she wanted to and stayed where she was when she didn't, and I'd never tried to lead her. He said, if you walked toward the lift, what do you think she'd do? I said, probably follow. But that's different from knowing what she'll do when she gets to the lift entry and smells 40,000 people above her. He said, 1 step at a time. I said, okay. I walked down the corridor toward the lift staging area. I didn't look behind me. I heard, after perhaps 15 seconds, the sound of 6 feet following. Then 12 more feet, smaller, quicker. Then, considerably further back, the sound of the 4 official handlers following at what they'd correctly judged to be an appropriate distance. We walked the full length of the sub-level corridor that way. I didn't stop. I didn't slow. I walked the way I walked every day in that corridor, which is to say unremarkably, with my pack over one shoulder, looking at the floor ahead of me. At the lift staging area I stopped. The lift cage was open. Beyond it, coming down the shaft, was the sound and the smell of the arena, the noise of 40,000 people, the circuitaire, the sand, the light. Hollow Spine stopped behind me. I heard her spine crests going up. I sat down on the edge of the lift threshold, on the metal lip of the cage, with the arena smell coming down the shaft and the light from above. Hollow Spine stood behind me for a long time. Then she put 1 foot into the lift. Then she walked in. I stood up and walked in after her. The cubs came in behind me without being asked. The arena floor of Kethavar Grand Circuit is approximately 120 meters from one side to the other. It is elliptical. The surface is compacted sand over a shock absorption substrate, pale gray in color, and when the lights are fully up, it reads almost white. The observation tiers circle the entire space, with the counselor's platform elevated at the north end, and on the day of the grand renewal final the tiers were at capacity, which is 40,312 seats. I did not count the seats. I read that number later in the inquiry documentation. What I knew, when the lift doors opened and I walked out onto the arena floor, was that it was loud. Not the kind of loud that is a problem. Just 40,000 people. I don't go to arena events. I work the sub-level. The scale of it was not something I'd prepared for, and I will admit that the first 15 seconds on the floor were slightly disorienting in a way that had nothing to do with the Kharveth, and everything to do with being a person who cleans drainage channels walking out in front of 40,000 witnesses. The lights were a different kind of bright than the sub-level corridor. They came from multiple angles, from the tier rail housings and the overhead array, and they turned the pale gray sand into something closer to white and cast no shadows in any direction. I have worked in the sub-level for 3 years, and I am used to knowing where the shadows are. And for a moment on that floor I didn't know, and then I found the center and I walked to it and I stopped. I stood still. Hollow Spine emerged from the lift behind me. There is a recording of this moment. It circulated considerably in the days following the renewal, and I've seen it from several angles: the official circuit camera, the counselor's platform feed, 3 or 4 spectator recordings. I know what it looked like from the outside, though it didn't feel that way from the inside. What it looks like from the outside is this: a very large black 6-limbed predator with fully elevated spine crests emerges from a floor hatch into an arena of 40,000 people. The noise from the crowd surges, and then, this is the part that circulated, goes still. Not immediately, but over perhaps 10 seconds, from the point where Hollow Spine clears the hatch and registers the full sensory environment of 40,000 people in elevated tiers above her, the ambient crowd noise drops. People in the tiers stop talking. They stop moving. It is the particular silence that descends when 40,000 social organisms simultaneously register that something very large and very dangerous has entered the space and is deciding what to think about it. From inside, what I knew was the sound of her feet on the arena sand, a different sound than the corridor stone, softer, with a compression to it. 6 feet, 18 kilograms of paw between them, moving at a pace I had never heard from her before, which was cautious. She did not move cautiously in the pen corridor. She moved with the exact confidence of an animal that owned everything in its sight, and the caution on the arena floor was a new reading of a new environment, and I stayed still and let her take the 12 seconds she needed. Hollow Spine stood at the hatch opening for 12 seconds. Then her spine crests came down by approximately half. Then she walked toward me. She walked past the 4 official handlers, who had emerged from a secondary access point on the arena perimeter and were standing very correctly still. She walked past the counselor's platform. She walked 40 meters across compacted gray sand in front of 40,000 witnesses, in a silence so complete that I could hear her feet. And she stopped at my feet, and she settled, all 6 limbs folding in the particular way the Kharveth settle when they are at rest in known territory, and she put her head on the ground near my left boot. The spine crests were at approximately 15% elevation. I have never seen them lower in a public environment. I have seen them lower only in the deep pen in the evenings, when the corridor was empty, and it was just the 3 of them and me. Des and Ova came through the hatch behind her. Des sat on my feet. Ova sat on his back. The crowd was still silent. I can tell you what I was thinking in that moment, which was not very much. I was thinking about the sand, and about whether Hollow Spine's crests would stay at 15% or drift upward as the crowd noise returned, and about whether the weight of Des on my feet was going to present a circulation problem over time. These are the things you think when you are standing in the center of 40,000 people's attention, trying not to move in a way that complicates the situation. You don't think about the 40,000 people. You think about the feet. I heard, after a moment, from the direction of the counselor's platform, Kharveth Os's voice through the arena address system. He was, to his credit, still attempting to narrate the situation as though it was proceeding according to plan. He said something about the demonstration of Kharveth behavioral calibration, and about the bond between the circuit's handling program and these magnificent animals, and about the years of dedicated work that had produced this exceptional display of species trust. He used the phrase, "our handling team," 3 times. I was standing in the center of the arena with a 1,400-kilogram predator at my feet and 2 cubs of approximately 300 kilograms each arranged on my boots, and I was trying very hard not to move in a way that expressed anything, because Hollow Spine was still reading me, and the crowd noise was coming back softly, and I didn't know what it would do to her crests if I shifted. Then I heard Os say, through the address system, "At this time, the circuit security team will escort our maintenance specialist from the arena floor to allow the demonstration to proceed." I heard footsteps, 4 of them, 2 security officers coming from the east perimeter access. Hollow spine-crests went to full elevation. Not gradually, not by increments. In one motion, all 47 amber ridges from skull to tail, rising together, and the sound that accompanied it was the full territorial warning, the sound I described earlier, the one that makes concrete feel unstable, the sound that the behavioral literature classifies as active protective assertion, which is distinct from attack warning in ways that specialists can tell apart, and everyone else just responds to by becoming very still. 40,000 people became very still. The 2 security officers became very still. They were approximately 12 meters from me. They were 12 meters from a Kharveth in full protective assertion. They were professionals, and they did exactly the right thing, which was to stop moving immediately and wait. The official handling team, to their considerable credit, also did not move. Thren, on the arena perimeter, had his hand up in the halt signal. I put my hand down slowly, and I put it on Hollow Spine's skull, on the base of the topmost spine crest, in the place where the crests originate from the bone. This is not something the behavioral literature recommends. It is something I knew from 3 years of sitting in the corridor, from the particular way she would bring her head to a level where I could reach it during the long evenings, and from the way the crests responded to contact in that location, in a way that was not in any published document, because no one who studied the behavioral literature would have tried it. The crests came down by 30% in about 8 seconds. I said quietly, without raising my voice, "Easy." The crests came down another 20%. The arena was so quiet that I heard the intake of breath from the tiers above me. 40,000 people breathing in at the same time. The 2 security officers did not come any closer. I am going to abbreviate what happened next because the full account is available in the inquiry report, and it is very long and a good deal of it is administrative rather than interesting. The short version is this. Os, from the counselor's platform, attempted to instruct the security officers to proceed with the escort using a secondary approach vector. Thren, from the arena perimeter, countermanded this instruction on the grounds of active handler discretion in a behavioral emergence event, which is a clause in the circuit's own operational protocol that he was legally entitled to invoke, and which Os had not anticipated. The security officers stayed where they were. The circuit's oversight delegate, a tall gray-uniformed woman named Assessor Ven Kalath, who was present in the counselor's tier for the renewal demonstration, requested that the address system be turned over to her. Os complied, on the advice of his legal aide, who had been whispering to him since approximately the moment the crests went to full elevation. Assessor Kalath said through the address system very calmly, "Handler, the floor is yours. Proceed as you see fit." She did not say my name. I think she didn't know my name at that point. She looked it up later. What I saw fit to do was sit down on the arena sand, because Hollow Spine's crests were still at 60%, and the crowd noise was still elevated, and the two security officers were still 12 meters away, and the situation needed the one variable in it that I had any ability to control, which was me, to stop being a variable. I sat down in the sand. I put my hands on my knees. I looked at the sand in front of me. The sand was pale gray in the arena lights and very fine, finer than I'd have expected from an outdoor substrate, and it had been raked recently. I could see the pattern of it. I don't know why I noticed that. You notice things when you are trying not to notice other things. You find a small true surface and you stay on it, the way Res Ovath once described it to me in one of her better moments. The thing about soil still is that it isn't blankness, it isn't the absence of thought, it is the opposite. It is being so fully present in the actual ground beneath you that everything else becomes less urgent by comparison. You are where you are. The sand is real. The weight on your legs is real. The air is real. The sound of 40,000 people receding toward the back of the awareness is real and manageable because you are in the ground with it. I don't know if that is exactly what the Kharveth reads, but it is what happens on my side of it. Hollow Spine's spine crests came down over the next 4 minutes and 40 seconds. I know that timing too from the inquiry documentation. I watched the sand. At some point Des climbed fully into my lap. He is the size of a very large horse, and he behaved as though this was a normal and obvious thing to do. And I did not argue with him because I was not in a position to argue about anything, and also because he was warm, and the arena had more air circulation than the sub-level corridor, and it was colder than I'd expected. At some point Ova leaned against my back. At some point I became aware, without looking up, that the crowd noise had changed quality, from the silence of held breath to something else, something that had a warmth to it, though I couldn't have said precisely when the transition happened. It had the quality of a room of people who have stopped being afraid and started being something else, something I don't have a precise word for. Recognition, maybe. The particular recognition that travels through a crowd when they have all seen the same thing at the same moment and understood it the same way. 40,000 people, watching a Kharveth in a public space come down from full protective assertion and put her head near a pen tender's boot, while the pen tender sat in the dirt. I think they understood what they were seeing. I think most of them understood it before Os did. When I finally looked up, approximately 12 minutes after I'd sat down, Hollow Spine's spine crests were at about 20%. She was watching the crowd tears with the lateral eyes, the slow methodical scan of an animal mapping the boundaries of the new territory. She made the contact assertion sound, the sound that marks territory that says, "This is what is here, this is the boundary of the known." The crowd was very quiet when she made it. I think they could hear it. The 4 official handlers came onto the floor slowly from the perimeter. Thren led. They came in at a wide arc and they moved the way they had learned to move in proximity to the Kharveth, which was carefully and without any quality of urgency. They gave the pack a wide berth. They positioned themselves on the perimeter of the area around me, not between me and the pack, around the periphery, in the patient formation of people who are prepared to wait. Hollow Spine watched them. The crest stayed at 20%. After another few minutes, Thren said quietly to me, "We'll take it slowly back to the lift, whenever you're ready." I got Des off my lap, which took some negotiation. He did not want to leave my lap. He was also approximately 300 kilograms, and he had strong feelings about comfort. We negotiated for a few minutes, during which Ova watched with visible judgment, and eventually he consented to stand up and allow me to stand with him. I walked toward the lift. Hollow Spine walked with me. The cubs walked with me. The 4 official handlers walked at the periphery. 40,000 people watched us walk across the arena floor. At the lift I waited while Hollow Spine went in, then the cubs, then I went in. The doors closed. The inquiry took 11 days. I was interviewed 4 times. Res Ovath was interviewed 6 times. Thren and his team were interviewed 3 times each. Assessor Kharveth oversaw the process personally, which the circuit's legal staff found alarming in a way they were too professional to say directly. Daveth As was also interviewed. He was interviewed in a different capacity. The inquiry report concluded with a finding in 7 parts, the short form of which is as follows. The demonstration had been designed without adequate weight given to behavioral assessments submitted by the circuit's own specialist staff. The official handling team had performed correctly within the constraints they'd been given. The civilian contract handler Yara Salk had acted within her operational discretion and had demonstrated practiced competence in a behavioral emergence event. Counselor As's instruction to remove the primary contact handler from the pen-side corridor during load-up preparations had been a contributing factor in the elevated crest response. And the circuit's predator management certification, which was subject to review by the transit authority at the oversight delegate's discretion, would be subject to a formal compliance review, the outcome of which would depend partly on whether the circuit's personnel structure reflected appropriate allocation of specialist expertise. In non-inquiry language, As's certification to run the Kharveth program was voided pending review. The review took 3 weeks and was not resolved in his favor. He did not come to the sub-level corridor to tell me any of this. I heard it from Res Ovath, who had the particular expression of someone trying not to show that they were satisfied with a development that they had correctly predicted. What I heard directly from Assessor Kharveth was a conversation that happened in the oversight office on the 3rd day of the inquiry. She had asked me to come in. She was a tall woman who was probably in her mid-60s, with the kind of face that had stopped making any attempt at expressions it didn't mean. And she sat at a standard official desk in a standard official chair, and she looked at me for a moment in the way that someone who interviews a great many people looks at a person they haven't quite fit into a category yet. She said, "I want to understand what you were doing when you sat down." I said, "Reducing variables." She said, "The crests came down in under 5 minutes." I said she read it as soil still. Assessor Kharveth said, "I read Dr. Ovath's paper last night. The terminology is hers." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do you have a different term for it?" I thought about that. I said, "No." She said, "What made you go back to the pen corridor after As told you to wait in the outer corridor?" I said, "Des made the distress call." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The cub." I said, "Yes." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "Your contract renewal comes up in 3 months." I said, "I know." She said, "I'm going to recommend that it be renewed at a senior specialist rate, with independent pen management authority, and with an addendum that explicitly designates you as primary contact handler for the Kharveth cohort. That addendum will be binding on all circuit operational planning." I said, "Thank you." She said, "I'm also going to recommend that Dr. Ovath's behavioral assessments be classified as mandatory review for any demonstration planning involving this cohort." I said, "She'll appreciate that." Kharveth nodded. She said, "Is there anything else you need from the pen management budget?" I thought about it. I said, "A door lock on the inner pen access. The cubs figured out the current latch. They've been getting into the outer corridor at night." Kharveth's expression did not change precisely, but something in it shifted slightly in the way things shift when a person decides something is exactly what they expected and is fine. She said, "I'll have maintenance see to it." I said, "The lock should engage from the inside. If I'm in there and need to lock down, I need to be able to do it without coming back out." She said, "Understood." The new lock was installed within the week. It was a very good lock, heavy, reliable, the kind that engages cleanly and holds. On the second morning after it was installed, I arrived at the sub-level corridor for my shift, walked to the pen access, and found that the lock was engaged from the inside. I stood at the door for a moment. From inside, I heard Des make the low, ambient morning vocalization, the one that means the territory is as expected, everything is in order, the den is settled and known. I knocked. There was a pause of perhaps 30 seconds. Then I heard the latch mechanism on the inside turn. The door opened. Des looked at me from inside the pen, from a position approximately 3 inches above my eye level, which was new. He had grown again over the inquiry, in 11 days. Behind him, in the deep pen, Hollow Spine was in her usual morning position. Spine-crests at about 20%, the morning quiet level. Ova was somewhere behind her, audible in the easy rolling contact call. I came in and sat down in the dirt. Des went back to his spot near the far wall. Hollow Spine watched me for a moment with the lateral eyes. Then she settled, all 6 limbs folding, and put her head down. I opened my pack and got out my breakfast and my health log review notes. The door was locked from the inside. The circuit was quiet. The sub-level corridor hummed with the usual environmental filters. I ate my breakfast in the known territory, with the pack, where I had always been. 40,000 people had watched Hollow Spine choose. Os's certification was in the hands of a review board that was not going to find in his favor. Res Oveth was going to get a line in an operational protocol that would outlast both of us, probably. All of that was fine. All of that was right. But that is not why I do this. I do this because on a day 3 years and 4 months ago, a very large and genuinely dangerous animal that had been lied to by the world about the category she belonged in, came to the threshold of her pen and stood there watching my hands. And in the stillness between us, something was established that had nothing to do with command or control or authority or any of the other words that Os would have used. She looked at me and decided I was in the territory. That was the whole of it. That is still the whole of it. Des puts his chin on my knee when I eat. Ova has opinions about which side of my back she leans on, and she will rearrange me if I sit down wrong. Hollow Spine watches the door every morning when I arrive, and her crests come down before I've fully crossed the threshold, which is something Res says has never been documented at this level of consistency in any other captive Kharveth in the literature. I don't know what she sees when she looks at me. I know what she has decided, which is that I am here and I am still, and the territory is known. That's enough, that's everything. When the arena went quiet and 40,000 people held their breath and Hollow Spine walked 40 meters of open sand to sit at my feet, Os was trying to explain it as a product of his program, his team, his vision for what the circuit could be. And I understand why he tried, and I understand why it didn't hold. You can't claim credit for something you did not earn. She didn't choose his program. She didn't choose his team. She didn't choose the ceremonial handlers or the command protocols or the official behavioral frameworks or any of the years of planning and budget and promotional material. She chose the person in the dirt. She always chooses the person in the dirt. That's all it ever is.